And it's time to look at the energy situation in the country, the energy mix, and indeed the commitments of the administration as far as energy is concerned. And of course, the policy statements of the administration. And joining us on this particular one, we have Mr. Nick Agule, who joins us from our Abuja studio, and he's an energy expert. Mr. Agule, good morning and welcome to the Morning Brief.
Good morning, and I'm happy to be here. And good morning to all our viewers globally.
Let's begin with the 418 billion naira power subsidy debt. That's the latest news coming through that the administration has incurred. And add to that, prior to this time, the conversation centered on the approval of 3.3 trillion naira debt owed gas companies. Perhaps we should start with that particular one. I would like you to provide us, clarity on the components of the 3.3 trillion naira, debt owed to gas companies, because that is at the heart of the conversation. How did we get to that before we weigh in on the 418 billion naira power subsidy debt and the solvency of the administration to be able to meet up with that subsidy debt?
Thank you very much, Bukola. Your question is apt. How did we get here? The simple answer is that we got here because Nigeria attempted a privatization of the power sector under the President Goodluck Jonathan's government in 2013. And that privatization was done so badly that it has led us to where we are. And for me, I keep advising that the government of President Tinubu or any government that succeeds them cannot solve the power sector quagmire in Nigeria without going back to that privatization and fixing it. Because when you privatize, you expect that efficiencies will be built into the system, capital will come into the system, and then money will be made, because goods and services will be supplied, and people will enjoy the services, pay for them, and then the investors will make money, and the investors will now be paying money into the public treasury because of the money they are making. That is an effective privatization, and I keep making the comparison with telecoms. So when we privatize telecoms, the operators brought in their money, they invested, they expanded output from a mere 500,000 active lines that NITE was offering us to over 220 million lines today. And because of that scale, they are now making a lot more money. They are not depending on government to pay any subsidy. There is no debt anywhere. MTN and Co are not dragging anybody for any debt owed them. There is nothing like subsidies. And the telephone is now cheaper than it was under NITE. And yet, there's liquidity in the system. And the telcos are paying a lot of money into government coffers. The opposite, the direct opposite, is the power sector. We did the power sector very badly. And because of that, instead of the power sector scaling up, increasing output from the 5,000 megawatts to maybe 50,000 or 100,000 megawatts today, that has not happened. And then we are now in this quagmire where electricity is generated and is not even transported, perhaps it's even used, but it's not even built, or the ones that are built, they are not collected because investments have not come to make that up. And then the government is now having to make up the difference. And we are creating this debt subsidy spiral, this circle of debt. And government will continuously now have to be using money to meet up, instead of government sitting back and expecting money to come from the power sector. And how did we get the privatization wrong? Two ways majorly. The first is that we privatized the generation and the distribution, but we left transmission in the hands of government. And transmission is poorly funded, so it's not being able to expand capacity to be able to take whatever a privatized generation can carry forward. What was the reason for why we did not leave transmission in the hands of the private sector so that they can also expand capacity? Because imagine, let me just give an equivalent. Imagine that we privatize the telecoms, and instead of allowing the MTNs and co to build their own infrastructure, we insisted that they must use NITES marks to sell telephone services to Nigerians. We would not have been where we are today. So why did we pin down? I know that some government officials or some experts will say that, oh, transmission is so sensitive, we don't need to leave it in the hands of the private sector. But that's not the case elsewhere in the world. Elsewhere in the world, you have a transmission, firmly in the hands of the private sector, and nothing is happening. In fact, I do say that if the thinking was that transmission was so sensitive and we didn't want to leave it in the hands of the private sector, why then have we left telecoms in the hands of the private sector? Because for me, telecoms is even more sensitive. Because as we speak today, government officials, our security chiefs, even the president and his cabinet, they are using private sector provided telephones. Anybody can tap into that. Yet we allowed the telecoms to go to the private sector. So for me, that argument that we shouldn't bring the private sector into transmission is totally flawed. What is transmission? Transmission is wires. You know, what Nigerians call high tension wires. That is what transmission is. What is about wires? That we will not let the private sector bring in the funding into that sector. So that's the first one. The second one is that we now privatize distribution. And distribution is the most important segment.
Mr. Aguilar, just before you go to the second point, are you saying that the same private sector that has been described as incompetent in handling what was even given to them, or at least handed over to them during the whole privatization process, 2013, should also have been given the transmission bit of it? Don't you think that would have been too much? Former President Muhammadu Buhari spoke to that, saying that those who got the companies weren't capable or competent enough. So if you had given the transmission based on his own narrative, wouldn't that have made everything collapse entirely?
Okay, so I hear that argument, and for me, this is where I fought late President Buhari, may he so rest in peace. I was listening to your conversation. I was driving into the studio whilst I was listening to your conversation at the beginning, where we're talking about the energy sector, specifically in refining. And, we're giving kudos to the president for allowing the private sector to come into refining, and now we have attained energy security, which is actually true, because given what is happening now with global supply chains, Nigerians would have been suffering petrol queues up and down. But you see, the point is that who is the private sector that was given the refining license? It's Dangote. He has the money. And he brought together the expertise. And he invested nearly $20 billion and he set up that refinery. But that was not the case in the power sector. In the power sector, we gave the licenses to entities that had no known history in the power sector. They don't have the capital, they don't have the managerial competence, they don't have the technology. I personally have their CAC filings. Some of the discos have as low as 5 million naira share capital, which is $3,500. How would you give a license to a company with $3,500 in capital to distribute power to 4 states? So President Buhari identified the problem. The capacity of the private sector was not there. But he now needed to have taken the next step, which is sack those ones who are incompetent and bring in the ones that are competent. I can assure you today that if that 2013 privatization is revisited and the private sector that is put in charge of both transmission and distribution is competent and they have the capital to bring in and the technology and the expertise, then the sector will boom. It's not going to collapse. Because, we didn't get to telecoms without money. MTN and Co. have invested in Nigeria more than $100 billion and counting to bring telephone to where it is today. The question is that how much has been invested in transmission? How much has been invested in the discos? Nothing. So if we don't invest, how then do we expect the service to work? I can assure Nigerians that if transmission today is put in the care of either Siemens Not like in the kind of deal that was run by the Buhari government, but a proper deal where Siemens take charge of our transmission and they are the ones to fund it, and then they provide the service and they bill and they make their money. Give it to Siemens, give it to EDF, give it to Manitoba, give it to any of these companies, and we'll not be talking about capacity anymore.
Let's even take the conversation further, Mr. Gule. And I know that when the president was campaigning as a candidate then and he went to the Chatham House, one of the things he said was that the model of our electricity sector or power sector in this sense is a broken model and he will fix it. Part of what he has tried to do in fixing it is to decentralize. Now, in decentralizing, states can now maybe generate, transmit, distribute, so we are now moving from neck to sex. What difference, let me put it this way, what should states begin to do besides just signing up regulatory authority and all of that? What practical steps should we begin to take as states such that we'll begin to see the impacts of the decentralization of the power sector practically, so that we can say Nigeria may be having epilepsy power supply issue, but state A, state B is 24-hour power.
You are very correct. Absolutely right on the money. The state, since the signing, and we give kudos to President Tinubu because that was one of the very first executive actions he took when he came into office in 2023. He signed into law the Electricity Act. And with the Electricity Act, states are now at liberty to, create electricity markets in their states and then create the enabling environment for the private sector to now come in and start generating electricity and distributing it in their states. And that is why, for me, when I wrote an opinion piece about the Gateway Airport in Ogun State, I said that for me, in terms of priority, Ogun State said they built an airport for cargo operations. And I said there is no cargo in Ogun State. Because if there is cargo in Ogun State, that cargo would have been, as we speak, going to Lagos Airport. And then Ogun State would have said, okay, let's now build a cargo airport so that it doesn't go. Is there any cargo on a daily basis from Ogun State going to Lagos Airport? Answer is no. So I now opined that they should have put that money into a power plant. Even if it was just a 1,000 megawatt power plant to power Ogun State, that would have had a far better economic impact than an airport with a runway that planes will not come to. So states really need to stand up. And the advantage now is that, unlike before, we were generating power in Nigeria using gas, that is the thermal, and hydro. Now, gas is found in the south. So we now had the choice of either transporting gas from the south up country to power plants up country, or set up power plants in the south and then transport the electricity generated up north, which is actually the national grid. So the national grid transports electricity from the point of generation to the point of usage. That situation is no longer there in energy transition. Under energy transition, we are now transitioning into renewables. And renewables, which is the sun, the wind, and the water, are found everywhere in Nigeria. So it is now advantageous for states to start using the renewable sources in their states, generating and supplying right there in their states. They may not even need the national grid anymore. And the reason why states haven't done this is that states are so fixated with airports. I can't even understand it. How do you build an airport when 90% of your citizens cannot afford a flight ticket? Instead of doing a power project that everybody will benefit from. So really, you are correct that the states must rise to the plate. But that's not to excuse the fact that, as we speak today, the lowest hanging fruit in the power sector are the federal government-owned power infrastructure. Generation is okay. The people who bought licensing to generation, they have the capital to expand it. Because the Lumelus and the Otedolas, they can expand generation. But currently, under the 2013 flawed privatization, they cannot expand that generation because there is no transmission to wheel it out. Now, if the federal government unlocks that transmission and brings in private capital to expand transmission from maybe 5 to 10,000, 15, 20,000 megawatts, that will allow generation to start pushing more power into transmission. And then the federal government must go and fix the discos. There is none of the, in fact, majority of the discos are insolvent. They are in receivership. So how can President Tinubu, for instance, watch these discos insolvent, sitting on licenses, strangulating the economy, Nigerians looking for power, they can't see power. Because like I say, anywhere you see a generator or a solar or an inverter in Nigeria today is demand for public power that is not being met. So how can President Tinubu see such a huge demand for public power that is not being met, and the operators are in receivership, and he's not taking the step to take the licenses away from them and reoffer them to competent operators who will now bring in the money and do to power what the MTNs did to telecoms? I think President Tinubu needs to step up onto the plate to get this done. The solution is not in GAMCO. In fact, when they did GAMCO, I wrote an opinion piece. I said, Mr. President, please be aware now that even the small power, the 5,000 megawatts, that transmission is taken to the discos, some of the discos are rejecting it. Why are they rejecting it? Because they have not invested to expand and modernize the distribution network. They have not got transformers in place. They have not got meters in place. Their wires are still hanging overhead, because if they invested, they will put their wires underground. And once you put the wires underground, nobody can steal your electricity. The rain and sunshine will not disturb your electricity. No car will hit a pole. You will supply electricity 24/7. You will make money. But they don't have the money to do that. And if your transformer is down, in fact, I wrote an opinion piece very recent. Something happened in Benue State. The North Bank of Benue, for those who understand the geography of Makurdi, the state capital, River Benue divides the state capital into the North Bank and South Bank. The entirety of the North Bank for months did not have electricity. Why? Because armored cables were bad. He had to take the state governor to now pay for the armored cables for JED, that is a disco, to go and now distribute power. This is total incompetence. That a distribution company does not even have money to do armored cables to sell their market. Mr. President, you can't be watching this and leaving it without action.
Mr. Agule, I'd like you to also speak to this, because earlier on you recommended the handover of the transmission component of the power mix to Siemens. But there was a Siemens partnership under the Buhari administration that was revived under the current administration that was supposed to add about 4,000 megawatts to the national grid. But it's been 3 months or maybe even 4 months since that partnership was revived, and nothing has been significantly done to alter the current scheme of things in the power sector. In fact, what we're seeing is power grid collapses and debts. Is it also a matter of incompetence of those who are handling the Ministry of Power?
Yes, it's part of incompetence by the people handling the Ministry of Power. And for me, I was actually very happy. Let me make a public confession. I was very happy when a letter came out to say that the power minister has resigned to go and run for political office in his state. And by the time he came out to say it was not true, I was very sad. Because the power minister is one person who has refused to step up to the plate. Anytime he makes a statement, he's talking about tariffs. Maybe because an accountant, he's thinking finance. But the problem of power in Nigeria is not tariffs. The problem of power in Nigeria is output. We simply have too little power going out into the economy. At 5,000 megawatts, Nigeria is the poorest in terms of energy poverty in the whole world. You know, I mean, I can tell you that, like in UAE, 12 million people, they have 45,000 megawatts on the grid. So the Siemens deal that was done badly. In fact, in terms of comparison, let me just put it like this. Imagine that when we have NITEL, and NITEL as a government company was doing very badly, we now decided to bring in MTN. But instead of letting MTN go do their thing, we now say, no, MTN, you need to work through the NITEL system. You know, NITEL is your boss. So you have to work with the NITEL system and see how we can increase power. I mean, the telecoms in Nigeria. The telecoms will never have the supply of tele will never have been, you know, improved to the level where it is today. The only thing that happened was that government said, MTN, take this thing and run with it. So that is what is needed in the power sector as well. If we tell CMS, come and take this transmission and run with it. I'm telling you that CMS will bring in the capital, the technology, and the expertise, and they will run our transmission to 10, 20,000 megawatts, even before a number of years.
Yeah, that's as vivid can get in description of what the current power situation is. But we must anchor the conversation at this point. It's clearly an ongoing one. Thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you very much, and have a nice day.